With this episode, we're going to be talking about George's father's store. So George is going to have some remembrances of that store, and he worked there a little bit, and his mom worked there. So go ahead, George.
It was interesting. The store was our living quarters were connected with the store. And in the neighborhood were there were Russian bachelors and single men, and the store was like a clubhouse for the bachelors that didn't have a married life. So they spent a lot of time in the store. They had chairs and just like being at a club. And many of them were Russians whose wives were in Europe and they're just working in the United States temporarily, supposedly. And I was quite young, and I was in a store. I'd be about 6 years old or older, and I got to be a kind of a conversation piece for all of the hanger-ons who met at the store, just like at the clubhouse. They had chairs there, and as a result, they were Russians, and I wound up. They were teaching me many Russian words and sentences, so I could Spanish, Peruski, the Zomish, and so they were kind of teaching me this, and I was just less than 8 years old. So I had an affinity with the Russian bachelors who had families in Europe and just working enough to make money to send back to their families in Russia. So as a result of my exposure with them, I picked up a lot of Russian expressions and language and so forth.
And what did you do in the store yourself?
Well, I was just nothing personal. Maybe I could wait behind the counter, and if someone wanted to buy, kids came and wanted to buy candy, we had candy display cases, or in cigarettes. I was available to sell them cigarettes or something it was just something that cash and carry, very short items.
And how old were you when this?
Well, this had to be around 10 years and younger. So I don't know how bad it might have been when I was 8 years old, when I could just comprehend how to do different little deals in the store and handle sales.
And when you weren't in the store or in school, what were you doing?
Well, the store, just sat around talking with people and so forth, and served them whatever they ordered or wanted to order. And mostly, we had a candy display, so the younger children that came in to buy candy, I was available to help them buy their candy. And so I could deal with them and older adults who would want some candy for their children. And an interesting thing about my father's store had a lot of creditors, not creditors, but gave a lot of credit. And so when families came in to pay their monthly credit bill, they always brought their children with them. And when they completed the transaction with my father and paid all of what they owed, it was okay, then my father would take candy and throw it on the floor, and the kids would scramble the families so they always made it a point to bring their children when they paid their bills. And then in the meanwhile, my father would take the parents out into the kitchen, and they'd serve them a good luck drink. They had a little liquor on it for luck. And the purpose of the liquor is always like, now today you have a Manhattan, but the Romanians and the Russians at that time, before every meal you always had a couple of shots of whatever they were drinking. So that was part of the rituals when they paid bills, and they socialized in the enjoyment of being paid full. And that's on the paying bills, you know.
What all did your father sell in the store? Was it a hardware store or
It was a
general?
grocery store.
A grocery store.
They sold all kinds of all the groceries, and of course, and they'd buy flour sacks, 100-pound flour sacks, and they would service. They'd open a sack of whatever amount of pound of flour they'd want. They'd buy 1 pound, 2 pounds. So he had flour sacks, and he sold flour loosely because that was before all this fancy packaging that you have nowadays. Everything was bulk, and stores had to dole it out. And it was interesting. All the flour sacks that came in with flour were really highly knitted and closed. The material was very closed, so the flour wouldn't seep through the material. And when the sacks were empty, my mother would wash them and take them apart and make aprons for my father and all the other clerks in the store. So everything was utilized. The flour was sold, and the sacks went there. And the sacks went there because it had to be a closely knitted material so it wouldn't seep through your material.
How long do you think your dad had that store?
Well, he had it, I got to think now. My memories go back to 1929 when the business, the prosperity was at the height. And then after 1928, 29, and 30, we went into a depression, and the sales tapered off, people were out of work. And in the meanwhile, of course, business was slowing down, and he had a lot of people that owed him money that never paid because he couldn't pay me. They weren't working. And then at that time, I remember starting in a junior high school, Barber Intermediate, which was out of our district. And then when the business was so bad that my dad was forced to close it, and we found a place out on the west side. The original business was on Joseph Campo, which was on the east side of Detroit. We found a place on the west side, and it was a predominantly Polish neighborhood, and he had a little store there.
So your dad had a second store on the west side.
A little store, kind of a fictionary store. It was some grocery, not very much grocery, but much candies and little things like.
And that carried him through the Depression years?
Yeah, and so he wasn't relying too much on the business because it was just confectionery candy and just small. He didn't have groceries. But he had the house that we lived in he bought us a big house and a two-story house, and it had a couple of apartments on the first floor, and the upper store had living quarters. So he rented these facilities to take him through the Depression. And the store, it was just kind of like something to keep active, but not necessarily a money maker. And that was also when times were pretty tough. Because we moved out on the west side in the early 30s from Franklin Street on the east side.
Do you remember the address or the streets?
4926 Scotton Avenue in Detroit. And this was a predominantly Polish neighborhood. But the store wasn't a money maker. It was just sort of something to keep him busy because he liked shopping with wholesale at the Eastern Market and so forth for little knickknacks that he could sell at the store.
So the Eastern Market was in existence even then?
It was very big at that time. And Saturdays at the Eastern Market, it was just flowing with people, mostly merchandisers and customers that was looking for fresh produce and everything. And the Eastern Market was a large market.
And they had all the dead chickens hanging up on the racks and everything?
Racks, and chickens or lambs or pork. And the Cosmopolitan store treated all the different nationalities and all different, and served them some of the favorite foods that they grew up with. And the Saturday with the Eastern Market was a very flourishing business. But my father every morning not every Saturday morning would go to Eastern Market, and would just kind of survey the situation and get ideas on pricing and so forth. And he'd buy stuff for the store that he'd sell retail at the store on.
And you went with him?
Not that, because I was maybe around in the early, well, late teens, after around 11 or 12 years old. He always went alone on Saturdays, always came back with either a chicken or something that he'd have for dinner.
And how did he get it back? Did
Carried
you
on a streetcar. He
on a
didn't have
streetcar?
He wouldn't buy the people would say, why don't you have a car, you know? And he said, I won't buy a car because I'm waiting for me to grow up. And I think the reason he never bought a car, many other elderly citizens would buy cars, but I think he couldn't read. And he did it, so he just camouflaged that he could have bought it, but he couldn't operate it. So as soon as and at that time, every boy in the neighborhood, as soon as they were 13 years old or 14, you'd go to the police department and get your driver's license, even though nobody had a car, but you could pass the test. So I had a driver's license at 14. And then at 14, my father bought a car. And this was interesting. I was in intermediate school at that time, and they came over after school let out. We went to a Ford dealer on Gratiot Avenue in Detroit and bought a 1932 Ford two-door sedan. And nobody knew how to drive, so the mechanic took me, who at that time was just 14 years old, and gave me my first driver's license. We got into the car, and of course, Gratiot Street was a very busy street, and he had me behind the wheel. I knew the fundamentals of shifting and so forth. That before the Model T, we had a 3 pedals. This was you could shift with the gear shift. So I learned how to shift with the gear shift. You have to push your clutch in and to release it slowly to go into second and so forth. And I was just 14 years old. And so we bought the car, and after this one lesson from the mechanic, driving the car around a block and through the traffic for a couple of blocks, I take over the car, and we drive home through heavy traffic, and I had everybody scared because I was hugging the sides of the road along the parked cars. I thought I was going to be hitting them because I was just getting acclimated to driving, and it was a busy street. So that was my first experience as driving a 1932 new Ford. I was 14 years old, yeah.
Did you ever have any accidents with the car?
Yeah, well, in fact, when we bought the car, the mechanic's going to show me how to drive the car. And he had to go through a tunnel to get out of the garage. And we got out, and I got a heavy traffic, got on the traffic, and I drove around a block and felt comfortable, he felt comfortable, so he came back, and then I had to make a left-hand turn to get into the garage. And I had to wait for the traffic. When the traffic subsided, I made a quick left-hand turn to get in, and I got into the tunnel of the garage, and I didn't swerve back, and I right into the side wall. I mean, brand new car, and everybody laughed, but it was absurd. I just scraped it. So we had to wait for them to bump it out and finish it off, which they did. We drove it home, a 1932 Ford.
Anything else about those early years on the west side?
Well, one of the exciting things, of course, we had a garage. There's a not attached in the back of the lot. And it's one night, there's another building. There's the tunnel, the gangway between the two buildings. There was a big fire in the garage. Somebody started the fire in the garage in the alley, and the flames came whipping through both our house and our neighbor's house. Fortunately, that was just a flame, but they got the fire out, which is that burnt the garage and kind of seared some of the car. It didn't do any real damage other than heated some of the points, and so they had to brush that off and clean that. So the first car we had was a new car and exposed to a fire the second night.
On the second night?
Yeah. So, but there was none of more than just being seared and a little touch up. It the car wasn't damaged, but the garage was damaged pretty bad.
Do you remember how long it took the fire department to get there?
No, I just remember the fire part. We were in bed at that time, and all of a sudden, my mother rushes up, and my father, we got up, and the flames from the garage, which was attached not to the house, but to in the alley where the garages were back in Detroit at that time. But they could see the flames coming in between the two buildings, but they didn't hit the house at that time. But it just got the garage and the fence and so forth.
Well, anything else about those days, or shall we wrap up this episode?
That's about the car.
Did you have anything more to say about middle school? Those were your middle school years, weren't they? Or were
Well,
you?
actually, I was fortunate because by going to the middle school that I went and had I should say, get a new address to be to live in a neighborhood, which we did live in, but it was a good junior high, and at that time when I went to junior high, I was in the seventh grade, and we had to prepare whether you want to go college prep or general or commercial. And Mr. Beatty suggested I take college prep courses, which I did. I didn't know anything about going to college prep. And at that junior high, your options were either French, German, but not Spanish at that time, and English. So I took Latin. I took Latin, French, and German.
So you took a little of all three of those languages?
No, just Latin.
Just the Latin.
Latin.
2 years of Latin?
Well, at that time, I didn't realize it, but at that time, in order to go to any university or college, you had to have 2 years of a language. And Latin was wasn't the dead language, but it was a required one if you could take. So I took Latin 2 years. And of course, it's a Romance language. In Romanian, Romance with Latin was pretty easy for me, except that you had to learn to conjugate your verbs and so forth.
All right, well, let's pause for now and come back with another episode.